Good morning. If you'll take your Bibles to Numbers chapter 23 with me this morning, I'm going to draw my thought from verse 10 of chapter 23, and just by way of review, it's a statement from Balaam the prophet, and he says, "Let me die the death of the righteous, and let my end be like his." And I wanted for us to give attention to that statement and focus on it as being a very common sentiment, I think, with people, and I'll explain more about that in a minute. In order to really appreciate this particular verse, it would be necessary, and I don't have the time to do that this morning, to give some background to it. And you would help yourself by doing some background study on this on your own. Study that would include Numbers chapter 22, 23, 24, 25, and then skipping ahead to chapter 31 of Numbers. But in an effort to try to set the tone here, really, let me do just a brief overview of chapters 22 and 23 in order for us to kind of see what's going on at this point and why verse 10 is significant. In Numbers chapter 22, the children of Israel had reached a very large population status, let's say. They had grown exponentially, numerically. And the king of Moab, who is Balak, enlists the services of a prophet. I've always pronounced his name Balaam, so I'll just pronounce him Balaam. He enlists the services of Balaam to curse these people. In other words, to pronounce a curse on Israel so that Balak could defeat them in battle. In the opening verses of chapter 22, we're given a little bit of information along this line, how Balak saw that all Israel, he saw what they had done, and he was very afraid of them because they were so many. And Moab was sick with dread because of the children of Israel, verse 3, 22 verse 3. And so Moab went to the elders of Midian and said, "Now this company will lick up everything around us as an ox licks up the grass of the field." And Balak, the son of Zippor, was king of Moabites at that time. And so he sent word to Balaam, son of Beor, at Pethor, which is near the river in the land of the sons of his people, to call him, saying, "Look, a people has come out of Egypt. See, they cover the face of the earth and are settling next to me. Therefore, please come at once. Curse this people for me, for they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land, for I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed." So Balak, king of Moab, thinks, well, he's got things in hand here if he can successfully enlist the services of Balaam to perform a job That job being to curse these people, to give Balak the upper hand in battle so as to defeat them and get them out of the way so they don't have to worry about Israel anymore. Well, in the rest of chapter 22, there's a lot of interesting things that transpire. Balaam says basically, well, I'd like to help you, but let me go to the Lord first and present it to the Lord, and then I'll get back to you. So he does. And, well, very briefly, in verse 12, God says, you shall not go with them, you shall not curse the people, for they are blessed. And and then Balaam kind of pushes the thing a little bit. And there's an encounter here with a donkey and the angel of the Lord that you'll read about, trying to persuade Balaam that he doesn't need to get involved in this. He just needs to back off. And he doesn't listen very well, as people are prone not to on occasion. And then we get into chapter 23, and the verses that I assigned for our text, which Chris handled pretty well, actually, involve an oracle that God gave Balaam to present to Balak, and he took up this oracle, and it involves verses 7 through 10, and my focus, of course, is on verse 10. Now, in order for you to appreciate a little bit more of Balaam, he was kind of a shady character. Yes, he was a prophet of God, and yes, he said to Balak, I don't care what you pay me. You can give me your house full of silver and gold if you want to, but I cannot and I will not say anything to you that God does not tell me to say. And my hat's off to him for that. Commend him highly. But Balak kind of keeps pressing the issue in an effort to try to persuade God, well, could you possibly change your mind on this? Because Balak has offered a lot of money. He's going to make it well worth my while. Is there any way that you could see clear to maybe... So Balaam is kind of going that direction. And he's pushing matters, and unsuccessfully so. So it comes down to about the end of chapter 25, I guess, that, or the end of 24 and into chapter 25, that Balaam apparently realizes, Balak, you're not going to get anywhere cursing these people. That's just not going to happen. But I'll tell you what might work is if you get these men involved in fornication with these Midianite women, you'll get them that way. And so Balaam initiates something along that line in chapter 25. And they get involved with Balaam or Baal of Peor, that's idolatrous worship, and fornication with the Midianite women. There's a specific instance that you'll read about in chapter 25. And you wonder, well, how is Balaam the prophet involved in all of this? And what does this have to do with him? Well, when you go to chapter 31, you get some insights in chapter 31 and verse 8, because at that point, Israel is involved in a full-fledged war against the Midianites. And in verse 7, they warred against the Midianites just as the Lord commanded Moses, and they killed all the men, and they killed all the kings, and they killed Balaam, the son of Beor, they also killed with the sword. So Balaam the prophet was also taken out in this battle. And you say, well, okay, he was at the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, no. Because if you drop down to verse 16, when they spared the women of Midian, Moses said, look, these women caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against the Lord in the incident of Peor. And that goes back to chapter 25. And there was a plague among the congregation of the Lord. All right. So Balaam is implicated here for something that he did, and it was not good. He was not a good character. All right. Now, I did that just to try to help us a little bit in terms of, probably understanding some of what's going on here. So I go back to the oracle of chapter 23. And I focus again on verse 10. Because Balaam expressed what I would think to be a common sentiment among people. That sentiment being, let me die the death of the righteous, and let my end be like his. Very common sentiment that people have. And people may word it differently. In fact, people do word it differently. They won't use these words necessarily. They might. But I've often heard people say, well, I know I need to make my peace with God. All right, there you go. That's the idea. Worded differently. But somebody has a realization that they need to get right with God so that their end would be okay, their death. Okay? I need to make my peace with God, or I need to get right with God, or however they term it. This is a very common sentiment among people, and I would even call it the most common prayer ever prayed. I wonder how many people pillow their heads at night and say something along this line. May my death be with the righteous. Not that they're anticipating anything anytime soon. But looking down the road, you want to be in the right camp and you want to be with the right people. You want to be on the right side with God. Balaam expressed that. People express the same. Different ways. Now I want us to focus on this statement a little bit in verse 10. And I want us to look at the statement itself. I want us to think about some things related to it. Let me die the death of the righteous, let my end be like his. Why is that a good statement? Why would it be a common statement for that matter? And what can we take away from it? Well, number one, obviously this is a realistic statement because it admits, one of these days is going to be my last. It's realistic. Yeah, that's realistic, all right. We can't walk through life thinking we're bulletproof. That's not realistic. But here's the realism, that Balak understands that, I'll come to the end of the road one of these days, and I hope and pray that when I do, that I'm counted among the righteous. That's a good thing. And I hope that everybody would have a similar dose of reality when it comes to that particular matter, to realize, God gives us life on this earth, and however long we live, May we live it to His glory and to the benefit of other people. Psalm 90 and verse 10 says it something along this line, that the days of the years of your life are 70. And if by reason of strength they are 80, then they are labor and sorrow. In other words, if you are fortunate enough to live to be 70, good for you. You've done well. And if you make it to 80, it's a little more difficult. Mary Brown and I were talking about that kind of thing just a few minutes ago. Yeah. Realistic. You know, it doesn't take a Solomon to realize we're all going to die one of these days. Okay, that's realism. Number 2, it's informed. It's an informed statement. And being that it's informed, you know, Balaam, although he was somewhat of a scallywag, he had some sense about him, and he was informed enough to know, well, yeah, I want to be in the right camp, you know, when that time comes, because as Psalm 116 verse 15 expresses, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of His saints, and that particular psalm takes us from the funeral home to the heart of God. Because when saints die, we mourn, we grieve, yes, but we thrill that they're right with God, and God welcomes them, and it's precious in His sight. So, yeah, it's informed. Any informed person, I would think, would express a prayer or a sentiment right along this line. Any informed person would want to do that. And then thirdly, it's important. Of all the prayers that we ever pray, and we pray for countless things, this is one of the most important things that you will ever pray for. Let my death be like the righteous, and my end like His. And when we go through life, may we be able to say, like the Apostle Paul did in 2 Timothy 4, verses 6 through 8, I'm now ready to be offered. The time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I've kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give to me at that day, not only to me, but to all those who've loved His appearing. In other words, all those who have thought it important enough to think, pray, and live along these lines. Can you see how this sentiment in verse 10 might be a very common sentiment? Very common prayer? Certainly. Now, there's a flip side to it also. Because as common as it is, and people who are not right with God might say the same thing here, you know, but they don't have a proper connection. So it's very common, is my point. But here's the flip side to it. And the flip side is that in a great many cases, it just might be futile for many, many people. Futile. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, you know, even though Balaam made this statement, and this statement is very powerful and pointed and needed, absolutely. Ironically, Balaam did not die the death of the righteous. He wished for it. He wanted it. This was part of his oracle, yes, but that's not how it turned out. Because if you go back to chapter 31, review the thoughts there, in 31, yeah, okay. It didn't turn out that way for Balaam. Now for us, This sentiment, lofty as it is, could be futile for a great many people for a number of reasons. Number one, people have the desire to die the death of the righteous, but they don't quite have the will to get there. Desire is one thing. Will is something else. Desire is good. You've got to have that to kickstart a life that's right with God. But then you've got to have the will to follow that out. And quite often, people don't have that will. We wish that they did. And we're trying to implant that will in the hearts of people every time we teach and preach. But here's a very common sentiment. The desire is good. Let me die the death of the righteous. Let my end be like his. But the will doesn't follow through. An example that comes to my mind is in Matthew 19 of the rich young ruler, beginning in verse 16, I think it is, where he comes to Christ on one occasion. He said, "Good master, what good thing should I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said, "Well, now why do you call me good? Keep the commandments." He said, "Well, okay, I've done that since the time I was a kid." All right, then Jesus said, "Do this, 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 and this." Okay, but then take all that good stuff that you've got, sell it off, take the money, give it to the poor, and come follow me. And that was the end of the matter. So there was no will, you see. His will didn't match the will of Jesus in that regard. Okay. Desire was good, the will didn't quite follow. How many people do you think are like that? A lot of people. A lot of people. And if we could just engage that desire to connect with a will that would tie in with life, you see, and just envelop everything that they are and do, it would be all right. But it's hard to get there. Another reason, so many people in the world today love learning. I love learning. You love learning. But a lot of people are learning, ever learning, and never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. Yeah, Balaam was a very learned prophet. And he knew which buttons to push, and he knew where he wanted to go, and what his real intent was, and all of that. And God wasn't going to allow him to go that way. But learning, yes, is good. But that learning needs to bring us to a knowledge of the truth. So 2 Timothy 3, verse 7, Paul mentioned that particular matter with regard to some women in the church where Timothy was located. And there were some problems and issues and heresy going on, and some women were involved in that. And Paul said, well, these people are ever learning but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. Well, you know, there's a big difference between learning and knowledge of the truth. Learning is good, yeah, but... And so sometimes the sentiment doesn't carry all the way through to knowledge that must be had. And then thirdly, as with regard to Balaam here, quite often people will think about themselves and not think about the impact of their lives upon other people. It's all right to think about yourself, to pray for yourself, to want the right things for yourself. As Balaam did in this sentiment, let me die the death of the righteous. Let my end be like his. Okay, yeah, that's okay. But then Balaam came to a sad end because of what occurred in chapter 25. That was because of what he did, what he caused, and the effect that had on other people. And the fact that what Balaam kick-started resulted in chapter 25 and verse 9, the death of 24,000 people. Imagine that. And so here's Balaam, and he's a sad example of one who thinks about himself but doesn't wrap his mind around the impact that his life has on other people. And so that's why I note chapter 31 and verse 16 here once again. Because of all of this that Moses had to counteract, it was through the counsel, that means the teaching of Balaam, that all of this occurred. It had a disastrous effect on Israel. Well, think about ourselves, but think about the impact that your life has on people that you know. You want to influence people for right. You want to point them to Jesus. Bring them to Jesus. Teach them about Jesus. And bring them to the point where when they die, they'll be with the righteous too. And their end like that. I mean, I think about this sentiment. Can we see why this sentiment might be so common? Can we see why it might be so important? Can we see how many people might express this way? And Solomon, or Balaam rather, a very sad example of someone who started out well but did not end well. And the New Testament has certain things to say in 2 Peter and Jude and Revelation about Balaam, the doctrine of Balaam, the way of Balaam, and so forth. So there's something about Balaam that we need to understand, you see. And if we miss the point, then we're missing something that would help us along these lines. And I hope and I pray, that you'll see this sentiment and take it as your own. Let it be your own prayer. But live it through. Walk with God daily. As long as you live, live it through. Don't let it just be a sentiment. Let it be a conviction and a way of life. And that points you to the cross, to Christ, and to the Lord who died there for you, that you might live for Him. And die the death of the righteous, because we all will one day, won't we? You better be making plans along that line. And if you haven't started, you better start now and get serious about it. And think about your obedience to Jesus now and your life of faithfulness to Him while we stand and sing to encourage each of you.